The war had begun with confidence, fueled by strategy and ambition. The rising empire had proven its strength on the battlefield, its forces striking with precision and dominance. But as the conflict dragged on, one question loomed over the minds of commanders and soldiers alike. How could victory be achieved against an industrial giant like America? With its vast resources, relentless production lines, and an economy capable of sustaining war indefinitely, the odds seemed insurmountable. Yet, the battle was far from over, and every decision made would determine the fate of nations. The weight of the war pressed down on every commander, every soldier, and every civilian who had placed their faith in victory. The enemy's strength was not just in numbers, but in its ability to outlast, to rebuild faster than it could be broken. Factories churned out weapons and supplies at a staggering rate. Warships rolled off assembly lines like clockwork, and every fallen soldier was replaced by another. Facing such an opponent required more than just brute force. It required precision, patience, and a strategy that could outmaneuver industry itself. Every battle could not be won, but every resource the enemy spent needed to cost them more than they could afford. Direct engagements against superior numbers would only lead to losses, so every movement had to be calculated. Strikes were made against supply depots, against fuel reserves, against the very lifeblood that kept their war machine moving. Air raids targeted shipyards, delaying the production of the very vessels that carried destruction across the seas. The more they were forced to repair and rebuild, the longer the war stretched, the more strain was placed on their endless production. But factories alone did not win wars. A force that believed in its cause, one that was willing to endure, could bring even the most powerful nations to a breaking point. While America had its industry, its people had never faced war on their own soil in the same way others had. They had never known the fear of invasion, of losing their homes, of seeing their cities crumble beneath the weight of destruction. That meant their will to fight had to be tested. The strategy was not just about wearing down their military might, but about breaking their spirit. Each campaign was designed to make the war costlier for them, to push their people to question why they were fighting, to make them grow weary of an endless struggle. Propaganda spread doubt, targeting the divisions that already existed, amplifying the voices that questioned whether the fight was worth the sacrifice. If the war dragged on long enough, it would not be just the soldiers who grew tired, but the entire nation behind them. But even as the battles raged and the strategies unfolded, the reality remained that their enemy had more than just strength. It had the ability to replace what was lost faster than it could be taken away. Entire fleets were destroyed, only to be rebuilt larger. Bombed-out airfields were cleared, runways repaved, aircraft restored to service. The losses that would cripple any other nation were merely setbacks. For every setback inflicted upon them, they pressed forward with renewed determination. There was no room for hesitation. Precision was everything. Convoys were targeted with ruthless efficiency. Submarines lurking beneath the waves to strike supply ships before they could deliver reinforcements. Every delay, every disruption in their war effort was another step toward evening the odds. If the right resources could be cut off, if their fleets could be stalled in the harbors before they reached the battlefronts, then the war could shift in an unexpected direction. The stakes were greater than any one battle. Every engagement was part of a much larger game, a contest of endurance rather than brute strength. The goal was not to defeat the enemy in a single decisive blow, but to make them question how much they were willing to lose. If their leadership could be forced to reconsider, if their people could grow tired of the sacrifice, then perhaps there was a path to something other than outright defeat. Yet the challenge remained. Every effort to slow them down only bought time. The war continued, the battle stretched on, and despite the careful strategies, the enemy's production never truly stopped. Victory could not be won through sheer force, but it had to be found somewhere in the spaces between battlefields, in the weaknesses that could be exploited, in the cracks that formed when a war dragged on for too long. The burden of command was heavier than ever. The decisions made now would determine not just the next battle, but the course of history itself. Every move had to be calculated. Every risk weighed against the cost of failure. The war was far from over, and as the enemy continued to rebuild, the question remained: could strategy alone overcome an opponent whose strength seemed limitless? Only time would tell. The soldiers on the front lines knew the weight of what they carried. It was more than just weapons or gear. It was the responsibility of holding the line, of proving that their cause was worth the struggle. The war was being fought with machines, with ships, with aircraft. But at its heart, it was a battle of endurance. A nation could build more weapons, more tanks, more aircraft, but could it replace the will of the men who fought? Morale was the true weapon that could turn the tide. A force that believed in its purpose would fight with a conviction that no amount of firepower could match. It was not enough to rely on superior tactics or well-planned strikes against the enemy's supply lines. The war had to be fought in the hearts and minds of those who lived it every day. The soldiers had to know why they were fighting, why they endured when the enemy had more resources, more reinforcements, more power. If doubt took hold, if hesitation replaced resolve, then the war would be lost before the battles were even fought. Every piece of news, every victory, every loss shaped the spirit of those who carried out the fight. Leaders knew this. The reports that reached the people had to inspire hope, not despair. The enemy's strength was undeniable, but its weaknesses had to be exposed. There were cracks beneath the surface, divisions in politics, shifts in public opinion, the natural exhaustion of a prolonged conflict. A war fought across continents was not easily sustained. The longer it stretched, the more difficult it became to justify. The harder it was to maintain the belief that victory was certain. The challenge was ensuring that their own people did not falter first. Fear was a powerful force, but it could not be allowed to control them. They had to believe that endurance was possible, that their sacrifices meant something greater than just survival. The soldiers in the trenches, the pilots in the skies, the sailors aboard the fleets, all of them needed to know that they were not fighting for a lost cause. The enemy's industry was unmatched, but the will to continue had to be stronger than the factories churning out weapons. That meant creating victories where they mattered most, not just in direct combat but in the perception of strength. A single successful strike against an enemy stronghold could shift momentum. A bold offensive, even against impossible odds, could reignite the fire within those who had begun to doubt. Stories of heroism spread across the ranks, tales of men who had stood against impossible odds and prevailed. These were more than just moments of bravery. They were symbols of resilience. Even in the face of overwhelming opposition, there was always a way forward. The war was not about matching the enemy's production, but about proving that they could never break the spirit of those who stood against them. But doubt was an enemy that could not be seen, and it spread silently. Every setback threatened to feed the uncertainty, to make the struggle seem endless. For every moment of triumph, there was another of loss, another reminder that the enemy could rebuild, could reinforce, could send more men, more machines, more firepower. The weight of war was not just in the battles, but in the unseen burden carried by every soldier, every commander, every citizen who waited for news of what came next. The battlefield stretched across land, sea, and air, but the true war was deeper. If the enemy could be made to question itself, to feel the exhaustion creeping in, then there was still hope. Wars were not always won by strength alone. They were won by conviction, by the refusal to surrender, by making the enemy believe that no matter how many resources they had, they would never have enough to end the fight. The war had already claimed much, but it was not over. The soldiers, the pilots, the sailors, they all had a role to play in something greater than themselves. The question remained, could they hold on longer than the enemy could sustain its will? If they could, then no amount of firepower, no vast economy, no endless supply of weapons would be enough to secure victory for the other side. The battle was no longer just about military strength. It was about who could endure the longest, who could fight through the exhaustion, who could prove that their cause was stronger than any industry, any factory, any machine. The soldiers who stood together, who held the line, who refused to surrender, they were the ones who would determine the future. The war was far from decided, but as long as their spirit remained unbroken, defeat was not an option. The vastness of the war stretched beyond what any one soldier could see. Battles raged across the seas and the skies, and on distant shores where men fought for ground that had changed hands too many times. The enemy's strength came from its ability to sustain this endless cycle of destruction and renewal. Each aircraft shot down, each warship sunk, each regiment lost was replaced with frightening speed. There was no pause, no hesitation. The sheer weight of their resources threatened to crush anything in their path. But even the strongest army relied on more than firepower. War machines did not move without fuel. Soldiers could not fight without supplies. Victory depended on the steady flow of materials, and no matter how powerful a nation was, it was not immune to disruption. The enemy believed itself untouchable, its production lines unstoppable, its supply routes secure. That assumption had to be challenged. The answer was not to fight them where they were strongest, but where they were vulnerable. The enemy's reach extended across oceans, and in those vast waters lay opportunity. Their supply ships, loaded with weapons, food, and fuel, crossed dangerous paths, often stretching for thousands of miles. Each vessel that failed to reach its destination weakened them. Every delay, every lost shipment, every sunken freighter made their war effort harder to sustain. The war at sea became a game of shadows, of silent hunters waiting beneath the waves. Submarines tracked the convoys, lying in wait for the right moment. When the torpedoes struck, they left no warning. Explosions sent flames shooting into the sky as steel hulls cracked and sank beneath the surface. One ship lost was not enough to break them, but one became 10, then 20, then entire convoys disrupted, forcing them to reroute, to expend more fuel, to stretch their forces thinner than they had planned. The air war followed the same logic. Bombers took flight under the cover of darkness, their payloads aimed not at frontline defenses, but at the heart of production. Oil refineries burned, rail lines twisted into useless scrap, factories reduced to rubble. Every mission was a risk. Enemy fighters patrolled the skies. Anti-aircraft fire turned the darkness into a storm of deadly flak, but when the bombs found their mark, the effect rippled through the war effort. Yet, despite the precision, despite the relentless effort to slow their advance, the enemy still pressed forward. Their losses mounted, but their economy adapted. They repaired what had been destroyed, redirected supplies, reinforced their production centers. They were resilient, and their ability to endure was undeniable. But endurance had limits. The war had stretched longer than anyone had predicted. What had once seemed like an overwhelming display of industrial power was beginning to show strain. The longer the supply lines remained under threat, the harder it became for them to operate at full strength. Their armies had to move more cautiously. Their forces, once unstoppable, now hesitated before pushing forward. That hesitation was everything. The moment they doubted their advantage, the moment they questioned their ability to sustain their war effort, the balance began to shift. Every soldier, every pilot, every sailor who had fought to slow them down had contributed to that doubt. It was not about defeating them in one decisive battle, but about wearing them down, making them feel the weight of a war that would not end on their terms. But the fight was far from over. The enemy had resources left to draw from, factories still running, warships still patrolling the seas. They were not broken yet. The challenge remained. How long could they be kept under pressure before their ability to fight collapsed under its own weight? That was the question that would determine the outcome of the war. The answer lay in continuing the strategy that had carried them this far. There could be no rest, no letting up, no assumption that the enemy would falter on its own. Every day that passed was another chance to push them further toward exhaustion, to make them question whether victory was worth the cost. The war was reaching a point where survival depended not just on strength, but on endurance. The enemy had been made to feel the consequences of their own overconfidence. Now, it was time to see how much more they could withstand before they reached the breaking point. The war had stretched beyond what many had imagined. What was once thought to be a campaign of swift victories had become a battle of attrition, an unrelenting test of will and endurance. The enemy still had resources, still produced weapons and machinery at a staggering pace, but cracks had begun to form beneath the surface. The endless conflict had taken its toll, and no amount of production could shield them from exhaustion. The strain was showing in their operations. Delays that once seemed impossible were becoming more frequent. Ships took longer to arrive at their destinations. Aircraft sat grounded for want of fuel, and soldiers in the field found themselves waiting for supplies that had once flowed without interruption. What had once been an unstoppable force was now stretched thin, forced to make choices about where to allocate its seemingly limitless power. Victory had never been about matching them in firepower. It had been about making their strength work against them, forcing them to bear the weight of a war that they had once believed they could sustain indefinitely. The longer the battles dragged on, the harder it became for them to justify the cost. Morale, once one of their greatest assets, was now another weakness. What had started as a fight driven by confidence and conviction had become a war of survival. Their soldiers, their pilots, their workers, all of them had begun to ask the same questions. How long could they continue? How much more could they sacrifice? No empire, no matter how powerful, could fight forever without feeling the burden of time. Even their leadership faced the growing reality that their ability to outproduce the enemy no longer guaranteed success. Factories could be rebuilt, fleets could be reinforced, but the will of a nation was not so easily replaced. The war had been costly, not just in material, but in the trust of those who once believed that victory was inevitable. It was no longer a matter of who had the strongest army or the most advanced technology. The war had become a battle of exhaustion, a contest to see who would reach their breaking point first. And for the first time, it was clear that the enemy, for all its might, was beginning to falter. That did not mean the fight was over. Desperation could drive an opponent to reckless action, to risk everything on one final attempt to turn the tide. A cornered force was often the most dangerous, but the fact that they had reached such a point at all was proof that the strategy had worked. Every battle, every delayed shipment, every loss that had forced them to reconsider their approach had led to this moment. The war had shifted from a contest of power to a struggle of endurance. And in that struggle, the advantage was no longer theirs. The soldiers on the front lines could feel it. The once unshakable force they had faced was no longer advancing with the same certainty. Their attacks had become more erratic, their movements less coordinated. The confidence that had once driven them forward had been replaced with something else, hesitation. It was in that hesitation that the war would be won. A force that questioned itself, that doubted its ability to continue, was already on the path to defeat. It was not just about pressing forward, but about ensuring that the enemy understood there was no path to victory left for them. The final battles would be fought not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who had once believed they could not lose. The war had been long, brutal, and costly, but the end was approaching. The enemy had relied on its economy to carry it to victory. But in the end, even the strongest economy could not fight a war that no longer had a purpose. As the final campaigns unfolded, as the last desperate offensives were countered and repelled, the truth became undeniable. They had fought with all their might, used every resource at their disposal, but they had been forced to endure more than they had ever prepared for. And in the end, it was not their factories or their warships or their endless supplies that determined their fate. It was the limits of their will to fight. The war had been won not through overwhelming strength, but through the careful, deliberate effort to make the enemy reach a point where they could no longer justify the struggle. The cost had become too great, the purpose too distant. They had fought as long as they could, but in the end, even the most powerful force could be made to understand when it was time to stop. As peace loomed on the horizon, those who had endured the war knew that history would remember this not just as a battle of armies, but as a battle of endurance. And in that battle, the side that had been expected to crumble had stood the longest. The war was over, not because the enemy had been destroyed, but because it had finally understood that it could fight no longer. The final days of the war arrived not with a single decisive moment, but with a slow unraveling, a realization that there was nothing left to gain, nothing more to sacrifice. The enemy had fought with everything it had, thrown its vast resources into the fire, believing that sheer force could outlast strategy, that industry alone could carry them through. But in the end, machines could not fight without men, and men could not fight without purpose. That purpose had eroded, ground away by the weight of time, by the exhaustion that seeped into every soldier, every commander, every leader who had once believed in inevitable victory. Across the battlefield, movement slowed. The air, once filled with the constant thunder of war, grew quieter. Supply lines that had once stretched endlessly, feeding the fight, had become tangled and broken. Convoys that had once seemed invincible were now easy prey. The great war machine that had once churned with unstoppable momentum was now faltering, its gears rusted by doubt and depletion. The realization that they could not win had settled over them, not as a sudden revelation, but as a truth too large to ignore. On the ground, soldiers waited. Some still held rifles in hands that had grown weary, still watched the horizon with eyes that had seen too much. But the battle had changed. The certainty of defeat had stripped away the blind determination that once drove them forward. Now, they stood not as warriors pressing an attack, but as men caught between what had been and what came next. They had been taught to fight to the last breath, but they had already given more than they could afford. The sky, once a battleground of fire and metal, was now still. Aircraft that had once streaked across the heavens in relentless pursuit of dominance now sat idle, their pilots knowing that no amount of air power could change the course of what had already been decided. The war had become an echo, each remaining skirmish a remnant of a fight that no longer had a future. In cities far from the front, the mood had shifted. The leaders, once so confident in their ability to sustain the war, now found themselves standing before a reality they could not deny. Their people, once driven by promises of strength and conquest, now looked at them with questions that had no easy answers. Factories that had worked day and night, pouring steel into the fires of war, now produced without direction. The economy that had once seemed limitless was now a hollow shell, drained by the relentless need to keep up with an enemy that had refused to break. And so the final decision came, not as an act of surrender, but as an acknowledgement of the inevitable. The war could no longer be won, not because their weapons had failed, but because their ability to fight had reached its end. There was nothing left to give, no reserves to call upon, no words that could convince a nation to continue a battle that had already been lost. The messages were sent, cautious at first, tentative, as if the admission of defeat was too heavy to be spoken outright. But the enemy knew. They had seen the signs, had watched as the war machine slowed, as the once unstoppable force became just another exhausted army on the verge of collapse. The response was measured, firm, but not without understanding. There would be no celebration, no triumph in destruction. The war had been long, and its end was not a moment of victory, but of relief. When the final orders came, soldiers who had spent years on the battlefield lowered their weapons, some with hesitation, some with an exhale of breath they had been holding for too long. Ships that had once patrolled the seas with dominance now returned to their harbors, their decks quiet. Pilots who had once taken to the skies with determination now remained grounded, their purpose fulfilled not through another battle, but through the absence of one. And then silence. It was not the silence of defeat, nor the silence of victory, but the silence of something ending, something that had lasted longer than it should have, something that had consumed lives and nations, only to leave behind the simple truth that no war could last forever. The world, scarred and tired, now stood at the edge of something new. For those who had fought, who had lived through the endless days and nights of fire and steel, the transition was not immediate. The echoes of war did not fade easily. The habit of watching the skies, of listening for distant gunfire, of waiting for the next battle to come, would take time to leave them. Some would never let go of it entirely. But the war was over, and time, if nothing else, would move them forward. The leaders who had once spoken of endless strength now spoke of rebuilding. The nations that had been enemies now faced the task of becoming something else. The world had changed, shaped by the war, by the decisions made, by the endurance that had brought it to its final moments. And though history would remember the battles, the strategies, the victories and losses, those who had lived it would remember something else, the way it felt to finally know that the war had ended. The machines of war sat still. The soldiers walked away. The world exhaled. The fight was over, not because one side had been crushed, but because both had reached the limit of what they could endure. And in the end, that was how wars truly ended. Not in fire, not in the roar of conquest, but in the quiet realization that there was nothing left to fight for.